The wind that swept through Aspen Hollow that October smelled of dry leaves and wood smoke, whispering through the empty yard behind Clara May Hollis's cabin, where nothing had grown since her husband's death. The townsfolk said the soil refused to take seed because she'd cursed it. They called her witch under their breath, crossing themselves whenever she came near the church well. But all Clara had ever done was bury her man with her own hands when the fever took him, burn the sheets he'd died in, and keep to herself ever since. She moved through her days quietly, stitching torn sleeves for the few who still dared bring work to her porch, speaking little, looking less. Every night she cooked a small pot of stew, ate half, and left the rest cooling on the step for stray dogs, because the sound of licking paws made the silence easier to bear. Then, one afternoon, as the light slanted copper through the trees, a horse came up the trail and stopped before her gate. The rider was tall and broad, hair streaked with gray, coat patched at the shoulders. Luke Barrett, the mountain man folks claimed lived with wolves. He dismounted slow, eyes kind but steady, and glanced at the empty hearth chimney. "You got smoke, ma'am?" he asked. She shook her head. "Wood's damp?" He nodded once, led his horse to the fence, and without another word began splitting logs from her pile. She wanted to tell him to stop, that she hadn't asked for help, but her voice caught on the word witch still echoing from morning gossip at the mercantile. The rhythm of his axe filled the air. Strong, even, like something older than rumor. When he was done, he stacked the wood by her door and brushed his palms. "You got stew left?" he asked simply. She hesitated, then pointed to the pot. He poured himself a spoonful, tasted it, and smiled faintly. "Tastes like home," he said, setting the spoon down. No man had spoken to her like that in years. When he left, the last thing she saw was his horse's breath rising against the fading sun, and she realized the air no longer smelled of fear. It smelled of pine, smoke, and something else she couldn't name yet. That night, as she stood by her window watching the leaves fall, she thought of the way he'd worked without looking at her limp hand, her worn dress, her shame. Maybe not everyone feared her after all. By morning, the gossip had already reached the general store that the witch had a man chopping her wood, and by noon, half the women in Aspen Hollow stood whispering near the sugar barrels. Clara knew their voices by sound alone, the brittle edge of judgment wrapped in false pity. And when she stepped inside to buy flour, the talking stopped so hard it hurt her ears. She kept her eyes low, but the storekeeper, Mr. Toller, cleared his throat and said too loudly, "Heard you had company, Mrs. Hollis." She nodded once, quiet. "A man helped with the firewood." His grin twisted. "Men don't split wood for witches, they do it for wives." The room chuckled, but before she could answer, a shadow filled the doorway. Luke Barrett stepped inside, tall enough to make the ceiling beams seem low, his gloves still dusted with sawdust. "She paid me," he said evenly, though they both knew she hadn't. "A fair trade for stew." The laughter died quick. He paid for nails and left, nodding only once at her. But that night, when Clara reached home, she found a fresh stack of dry timber and a note carved into a scrap of pine. "You don't owe me." She pressed her palm to the grain, something tight in her chest she hadn't felt since before the fever. Still, the next day, 2 men from town came knocking, the preacher's son and the sheriff's deputy, saying it wasn't proper for her to entertain a stranger alone. "We can't have your kind stirring up more trouble," one said, eyes flicking toward the dirt path where Luke's boot prints still showed. Clara folded her hands. "My kind?" she asked softly. The deputy smirked. "The ones who bury their husbands before the doctor arrives." Her breath caught. They didn't know the truth, that her husband's fever hadn't taken him fast enough, that she'd begged the preacher to send help, and that no one had come until after she'd closed his eyes herself. The town had chosen its version of the story, and never let it go. That night, she sat by the dying fire and whispered into her hands, "Let it end." Outside, faint hoofbeats came again through the wind. Luke stood by the porch, carrying something wrapped in burlap, a rough door hinge and a hammer. "You need a new latch," he said simply, stepping close. "That one's rotted clean through." She didn't ask how he knew. When his hand brushed hers, she flinched not from fear, but from the strange warmth that came with it. For the first time in years, the word witch sounded smaller than her name. By the third morning, a cold wind rolled down from the ridge, carrying the kind of silence that made people look for someone to blame. The blacksmith's wife swore she'd seen smoke rising from Clara's yard at midnight, and by sunrise, half the town claimed she was summoning the dead again. Clara had stopped defending herself months ago. It never mattered. But this time the whispers turned to stones. When she walked past the schoolhouse, a boy threw one at her shawl, small but hard enough to bruise. The teacher didn't stop him. She just turned away. Clara kept walking, her breath shaking in the cold. But when she reached her gate, Luke Barrett was already there, hammering something into the earth beside her porch, a post of thick pine, squared and level. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "They'll see you." He didn't look up. "They already do." She frowned. "Why are you building that?" He straightened, eyes calm but unyielding. "Because they call you cursed for what you lost, so I'm making something that gives instead of takes." Then he lifted another beam onto his shoulder and carried it toward the yard. She followed, wordless, as he began marking the soil with chalk and measuring the space beside her door. "What is it?" she asked. "A kitchen," he said simply. "You'll have light to cook by when the frost sets in." She stared at him, stunned. "Why would you—" "Because fire kept in the open burns rumor faster than wood," he interrupted, half smiling. "Let them see it lit." The first hammer strikes echoed through the hollow, sharp and sure. By noon, a few onlookers had gathered at the fence, men pretending to smoke, women clutching their aprons, but none spoke. They watched as the mountain man worked beside the woman they'd condemned, both steady, as if they'd done it 100 times before. When Luke paused to drink, he handed her the tin cup first. "They'll talk," she whispered. "Then make them say something true," he replied. That night, when the light from the unfinished kitchen glowed against the falling leaves, no one in Aspen Hollow said the word witch. They said fire. 2 days after Luke began the kitchen frame, the preacher's wife sent word that the witch's helper should leave before Sabbath. The message came tucked in a basket of salt, a frontier warning that Clara understood too well. Salt meant purification, or exile. She stared at it for a long time, then poured the grains into the fire, watching them crackle like tiny storms. Luke found her there when he returned with lumber. "They're trying to scare you," he said quietly. "They don't scare me," she answered, though her hands still shook. "They shame me." He knelt by the hearth and began laying out tools. "Then we'll build louder." That afternoon, she helped him hold the boards while he nailed them in, her hair catching bits of sawdust, her sleeves rolled up like she'd never been afraid of work. For the first time, her laughter broke through the hollow silence of her yard, a soft, surprised sound that made him look up mid-swing. "What?" she asked, flushed. "It's been too long since this place heard something honest," he said. By dusk, The frame of the kitchen stood solid against the gold sky. But as they packed up the tools, a wagon rolled up the path. It was Sheriff Kell, hat low, reins slack. "Evenin', Barrett," he said, eyes narrowing. "Town council says this building ain't permitted. Woman's property's under moral review." Luke wiped his hands, slow, leaning on the post. "Then tell the council to build their own courage before they tear down someone else's." The sheriff's jaw tensed. "Careful how you talk, mountain man." Clara stepped forward then, voice clear for the first time in months. "He's fixing what you all broke." The words stunned even her. The sheriff turned red, muttered something about witch's tongue, and rode off, the dust rising behind him. Luke looked at her, half smiling. "You just told the law to mind its manners." She exhaled, trembling. "Felt good." He nodded. Good should never feel strange. When he left that night, she stood at the half-built kitchen door, hand against the wood. For the first time in years, her world wasn't shrinking. It was being rebuilt, nail by nail. The morning the kitchen walls went up, Aspen Hollow woke to the smell of smoke. And for once, it wasn't from rumor. It was from her stove. Clara had stayed up half the night sanding the boards Luke had fitted, her hands raw, her heart wild with something she hadn't felt since before the fever. Purpose. When the first flame caught in the new stove, the heat rolled over her face like a blessing. She cooked bread that morning, real bread, not the ash-tasting scraps she'd lived on for years, and the smell drifted through the valley until children passing on the road slowed down just to breathe it in. One little girl, barefoot, curious, stopped by her fence. "Mama says you make dark spells," she whispered, eyes wide. Clara knelt, wiping flour from her cheek. "Only the kind that rise when you feed them right," she said, handing the child a crust. The girl giggled and ran off, crumbs trailing behind like small suns. But by midday, half the town had gathered again at a distance, watching the smoke curl steady from her chimney. Luke stood beside her porch, arms folded, quiet. "They're seeing something they can't explain," he said. "A woman they buried standing again." She looked at him, the light catching in her eyes. "What do you see?" He hesitated, then said softly, "Someone worth standing with." Before she could answer, a shout broke through the air. The preacher's son had come with 2 men and a bucket of river water, yelling about purging sin. He swung it toward the fire, but Luke caught his wrist mid-motion, voice low and calm. "You put that out, and you'll answer to me." The man froze, eyes darting to the growing crowd. "You defending her now?" he spat. "You'll burn with her." Luke let go, slow and deliberate. "Then maybe the mountain needs 2 more ghosts." No one moved. The bucket hung in the air, trembling, until the younger man turned and fled. The others followed. When they were gone, Clara turned back to her stove, stirred the bread again and whispered, "They'll hate you for this." Luke shook his head. "Hate's lighter to carry than regret." That night, when the last loaf cooled on the window ledge, she sat beside the glow and realized something had changed. For once, the fire wasn't defense. It was invitation. By the week's end, the smell of baked bread had turned from curiosity to accusation. The preacher's wife declared that witch smoke had clouded the church bell, and 3 families refused to draw water from the same well Clara used. The town called a meeting under the oak square, lanterns swinging in the dusk, and though she hadn't been invited, she heard the voices rising through the wind like knives scraping iron. Luke came down from the ridge before dawn, jaw tight, coat damp from mist. "They're planning to have you gone by Sunday," he said. "Sheriff says it's to keep peace." She smiled faintly, though her eyes were tired. "Peace for them always means silence for me." Luke set a sack on the table, a crate of nails, fresh pine boards, and a folded letter sealed with twine. "Then we make noise." She looked at him, confused. He handed her the letter. Inside, in his careful block writing, were 6 signatures: ranch hands, widows, and 2 miners, all men and women from the edge of the valley who'd eaten her bread or shared her fire in passing. "We, the undersigned, affirm that Mrs. Clara May Hollis is no witch, but a good woman who fed us when others shut their doors." Her hand shook as she read it. "You made them sign this?" she whispered. "No," Luke said. "They asked to. You showed them light when no one else did." By noon, he nailed the paper to the chapel door in full view of the town. The sound of hammer blows carried like gunfire. When the preacher came out, red-faced and trembling, Luke only said, "If you're going to call her names, use the right ones." That night, torches flared near Clara's fence. 3 men shouting, daring Luke to come out. He did. Without a weapon, without a word, just walked up to the fence line and stared until they dropped their torches and left. When he turned back, Clara was standing in the doorway, the lamp behind her glowing gold through her hair. "They'll come again," she whispered. He nodded. "Then we'll leave light enough they can't stand the dark." And for the first time, she didn't hide from that promise. She stepped forward, took his hand, and said, "Then we'll finish this kitchen tomorrow." In her voice was the sound of a woman reclaiming her place in the world. The next morning broke clear, the kind of quiet gold that only came before autumn's end. Clara woke early, kneading dough on the new wooden table, while Luke patched the final boards along the kitchen wall. The rhythm of their work filled the air, soft, steady, belonging, and for a brief hour, it almost felt like any other home in Aspen Hollow. Then a scream tore through the stillness. Down by the creek, one of the preacher's daughters had slipped from the ridge where the ground had turned slick from dew. Clara didn't think. She just ran. Her boots slid through mud, her skirt tore against brush, and when she reached the edge, she saw the girl clinging to a root above the freezing water. "Hold on," Clara shouted, dropping to her knees, stretching her arm until her shoulder burned. The girl was trembling, eyes wide with terror. "Please," she gasped, "don't curse me." Clara ignored the words, digging her heel into the dirt for leverage, her palm raw from gripping the girl's wrist. Then another weight pressed beside her, Luke, solid and silent, reaching down with his other arm. Together they pulled until the girl collapsed into the mud between them, sobbing but safe. The preacher arrived minutes later, breathless, with half the town behind him. He froze at the sight. The woman he'd condemned kneeling beside his child, wrapping her coat around the girl's shoulders. For a long time, no one spoke. Then the preacher whispered, almost breaking, "You saved her." Clara stood slowly, mud streaked across her face. "Would you have let her drown to stay clean?" she asked. He didn't answer. Behind him, the sheriff lowered his hat, shame in his eyes. When they left, Luke turned to her quietly. "You just broke the spell." She frowned, confused. "What spell?" He smiled faintly. "The one they all cast on themselves." That night, as the bread rose and the kitchen filled with warmth, Clara stood by the doorway watching the stars through the smoke. For the first time she realized the town's silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was listening. By the next afternoon, the air in Aspen Hollow had changed. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but the sharp edge of fear had dulled into something quieter. Something curious. Children no longer crossed the road when they saw her coming. The blacksmith, once the loudest to call her cursed, tipped his hat when she passed the forge. Still, Clara didn't trust it. Years of being the whisper at the edge of every prayer made her wary of soft voices. She was stirring soup on the new stove when she heard hooves crunch the gravel outside. When she opened the door, the preacher stood there, hat in hand, no congregation behind him this time. He looked smaller than she remembered. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, voice rough, "I came to thank you for my daughter." She nodded but didn't step aside. "You already did when you walked away." He hesitated, eyes dropping to the floorboards. "There's more. Folks say Luke Barrett's been staying up here. That true?" Her spine straightened. "He works here. Helps me finish what needs doing." The preacher nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "Then let him. God sends hands, not halos." The words startled her, hearing mercy from the same mouth that had once condemned her. He looked past her then, toward the kitchen walls still drying with fresh varnish. "You built this with your own hands?" She smiled faintly. "With help?" He nodded again, throat working like the words were heavier than they should have been. "Then maybe I misread what kind of fire you kept." He turned to go, pausing once more. "The town will be talking different soon, Mrs. Hollis. Don't waste it hiding." When he left, Clara stood in the doorway for a long time, the cool wind lifting the hem of her skirt. Luke returned from the ridge at dusk and found her still there, a strange light in her eyes. "You're thinking too hard," he said. "I'm remembering what it feels like to be seen," she whispered. "Careful," he teased gently. "It'll become a habit." She smiled, but when she looked at the kitchen glowing behind her, it no longer looked like a shelter. It looked like a beginning. By the week's end, the kitchen no longer belonged to silence. Every morning the smell of fresh bread rolled down the valley, and by noon, neighbors who once crossed themselves at her shadow now stopped at her fence with awkward smiles and empty jars. Clara never refused anyone. She just ladled soup, broke bread, and let her hand speak what words couldn't. Luke watched from the porch as she moved among them, quiet but certain, her laughter soft and real now, the same laugh that had first startled him from his solitude. But peace, he knew, never came without a test. That test arrived on a Sunday afternoon when the sheriff rode up with the councilman and the preacher trailing behind, a folded paper clutched in his hand. "This meeting's official," he said, voice tight. "We're here to decide what becomes of this property. It's been under suspicion for moral corruption." Luke stepped forward, wiping sawdust from his hands. "You'll have to name the sin first." The sheriff glared. "You building here without permission, for one. Her keeping company with a man outside the law, for another." Clara raised her chin, her voice steady. "If kindness is corruption, you'd best arrest half the valley." Murmurs rose among the onlookers, miners, widows, even the blacksmith's wife, all standing just beyond the fence. The preacher cleared his throat. "There's no corruption here, Sheriff, only correction, of our own hearts." The sheriff faltered, eyes darting toward the crowd now nodding with quiet assent. Then a small voice broke through the noise. The preacher's little girl stepped forward, holding a loaf of bread with both hands. "She made this for me," she said. "And she saved me." The silence that followed felt holy. No one spoke. Then Clara stepped closer, meeting the sheriff's gaze. "You said this land was under review. Then look at it. Does it look like sin or mercy?" The man looked around, the kitchen standing bright, the fields cleared, the air rich with the scent of bread and wood smoke. His jaw worked, but no words came. Finally he muttered, "Case dismissed," and turned away. Luke exhaled slow, the tension leaving his shoulders. Clara's eyes shimmered. "You didn't have to fight them," she whispered. You already did, he said softly. That night, the kitchen light burned late, not as defiance, but as welcome. Winter came soft that year, its first snow falling like quiet forgiveness over Aspen Hollow. The fields lay white, the pines bowed low, and from the hill above the town, the only light that moved was the one from Clara's kitchen window. Inside, warmth bloomed. The smell of stew, of wood smoke, of something finally safe. She stood by the table, sleeves rolled, hair loose, shaping the last loaf of the season while Luke mended a hinge by the door. Neither spoke much anymore. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed, no longer full of fear or waiting, but of peace. Outside, hoofprints led up her path, and when she opened the door, two strangers stood there, a mother and son traveling west, their horse thin, their faces half-starved. "We heard there was food here," the woman said timidly. Clara stepped aside without a word. Luke rose, set 2 more bowls on the table, and when the boy hesitated, Clara smiled. "You're safe here," she said simply. They ate slow, grateful, while the wind whispered against the eaves. When they left at dawn, the boy turned back to wave, and Clara's breath caught, because she realized this was what it meant to belong, not to be defended, but to become the refuge itself. Luke came to stand beside her, his voice low. "You've turned this place into something the mountain needed." She looked at him, eyes wet with quiet joy. "And what's that?" He smiled faintly. "Mercy that stays." She laughed softly, the sound rolling through the kitchen light like prayer. Outside, the valley shimmered gold beneath the rising sun, and smoke curled upward into the still air. The witch they'd once feared was gone. And in her place stood a woman who had built not magic, but a home. If this story touched your heart, take a breath before you leave. Somewhere out there, another soul is being called names they don't deserve. May we all remember Clara's lesson. Sometimes the truest faith is just building light where others tried to burn you down.